Yo, comrades, welcome to this week's episode of Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. We're coming at you this week with part 2 of our Enchantments of Mammon reading series with our podrads from the Regrettable Century. For part 2, this is going to be CC Don leading this one, and we're going to be focusing more on that early 18th and 19th century history in the United States specifically. Going to talk about Transcendentalism, Puritanism, and all sorts of other types of misenchantment. We got a long one for you today, so we're just going to jump right in. But you know the deal. Let's run down the various ways you can support not only Red Library, but all of our podrads across the Lost Horizons podcasting network, which includes us, obviously the Regrettable Century, and From 78. Remember that we have a shared network podcast series called Well, Here We Are Still After All. You can find a link for our Lost Horizons network feed down in the show links for this episode and every Red Library episode. If you really like the work that we're doing here on Red Library and want to support us materially, remember, head over to Patreon, and for as little as $1 a month, that is roughly a quarter an episode, you can get access to our Red Library Discord server. We have so many cool things going on over there. Reading groups, we're organizing roundtable discussions for patron-only episodes, we're doing movie nights, and we're collectively developing the dialectical pessimist perspective, ongoing in real time, and it's a hell of a lot of fun. We're currently trying to get up to 100 patrons as our new goal, and we are fast on the way there. So if you'd like to help us get to that, you know what to do. Remember to like Red Library on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, like, subscribe, share, all that other stuff. If you're listening on iTunes, please remember to go down and give us one of those star reviews. Takes half of a second and gets us into more potential comrades' listening feeds all across the globe. All right, y'all, without further ado, here we are with Enchantments of Mammon, Part 2. Coming at ya. Oh, yeah! All right, well, let's officially kick this off. So let's go. Enchantments of Mammon Part 2, Lost Horizons time, Red Library, the Regrettable Century time. All right, so do we want to quickly go around, just say who's all on? Because, again, we're going to have sort of rotating characters on this series. So I'm Comrade Adam.
This is CC Don.
I'm Chris.
I'm Jason.
And we used to have a guy on the podcast named Kevin who I don't know what happened to him. I think he got abducted by aliens or something, but he's not here this week.
R.I.P. Kevin. God rest his soul.
Yeah, yep. You will be missed. You will be missed, Comrade Kevin. We'll pour one out for you along the way.
What happened was he was crying while listening to Dashboard Confessional, and he drove off a cliff.
I feel like that's y'all's show's drama. We're not going to comment on that. But I'm leaving all of that in.
He's going to be mad at me.
The best part is the thing he's going to be mad about is that you said he listens to Dashboard Confessional.
Yeah, exactly. Whatever, some other crying wuss band.
like Satyricon.
Do you like Satyricon? I don't like Satyricon.
No, I'm just...
All right.
It's not everything can be gold, man. Come on.
So you edit that out. Edit Jason fucking flopping out.
We're off to a real strong start here for part 2. All right, so I guess
before we dive in, since you guys were all on part 1, do you guys have anything you want to cover from part 1 follow-ups?
Nothing in particular. I will say apparently the part 1 has made quite a splash. A lot of listeners over on, I think, both of our shows are big fans of the content. So it's good to see that we're kind of mining through this huge tome. So I don't know. What about y'all?
Yeah, we've been getting a lot of good feedback about it as well. And I think that this is not a subject that most people on the left would ever even touch. Mm-hmm. Specifically because of its overtly spiritual and religious, currents, undertones throughout the entire book. It talks about the enchantment of nature in a positive way, which I think that most Marxists, most leftists would see as sort of anathema. So it's actually making people think about things that they don't necessarily ever want to think about. So I think it's good stuff.
Jason, what do you got?
Nothing.
He loves doing this shit. He loves putting people on the spot when they don't have anything to say.
Oh yeah, that's like my thing. It's a weird, like unconscious tick that I have. Actually, I do have one thing that I want to throw out, and we can maybe just keep this very, very brief. But I feel like some of the discussions that have been going on post us doing part one, I think, did bring up an interesting question about, is focusing on this Gothic, romantic, warmed strain in Marxism, this sort of religious, spiritual undercurrent, what about this is different than the standard, like, idealist perspective on radical and revolutionary policies versus a materialist one? Because I feel like I know we had a conversation about this, but the idea that focusing on this particular perspective is sort of falling back into idealism. And I think from the dialectical pessimist kind of perspective, I feel like we're all pretty clearly saying like it's something different than that.
Yeah, I think that choosing to acknowledge our humanity isn't falling back into idealism. You know, I think that's what we're doing here. You know, and I think that what we're doing is getting at something that is a deep part of the human psyche that is pretty much ignored by a majority of the left and has real material consequences. And I think that what a lot of people on the left would have us do is just ignore this part of what it is that makes us human, and leave that to the fascists to completely and wholly own something that is very, very relatable on a very deep level to a lot of people. And I'm not really willing to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like when we read about, is in part 2 of this book, people like Emerson and Thoreau and Nat Turner, actually, and the sort of romantic impulse to resist the march of modernity in whatever form that it presented itself. There's a way of approaching it, which is to say, like, that's a natural way to respond to things when you don't yet have a materialist conception of history, but we've moved beyond that. And for us, I think, like, I would at least say that we're trying to reincorporate or rediscover some of the impulse. So when we talk about the romantic strain in Marxism, it's not a grafting on of a pre-Marxist anti-capitalism or radicalism, but it is carrying on in the lineage of that essentially human impulse to resist all that is inhuman in the organization of the present society.
Yeah, here. I'd agree with that.
All right.
All right. So I guess CC Don, you're in the driver's seat for part 2. So I think you're going to principally be leading us through, but then we'll be just have an open discussion along the way. Questions, comments. So where do you want to start? Cool.
I'm just going to give a brief overview of what part 2 covers. So it's going to cover America from the early 1500s to the late 1800s. We're going to move from the Puritans to the Great Awakening and the Evangelicals.
Boo! Drag 'em!
To the Romantics and Transcendentalists, through people like Thoreau, Whitman, and Emerson. And a little bit of a spoiler alert, they will all adopt a pecuniary logic and the idea that success in the marketplace is the sign of spiritual virtue.
Also, boo.
Yeah. So,
yeah, dude. It's almost like that just indulging in any of that, like, Puritanism is like a fucking disease that just grows in you.
Like a goddamn xenomorph.
Yep. That's my idealist take on the germ of just Puritanism that infects you.
All right, well, let's get started on chapter 4 then.
Fuck yeah, let's roll.
So that'll be where he covers the Puritans mostly. And he wants to talk about and says the first generation or two had a bit of an ambivalence or an aversion to market morality, but that faded rather quickly. And the idea of a social gospel of like love through commerce eventually gets degraded. And he kind of makes a comparison between a character named Robert Keene, who was criticized and brought to court by John Cotton and Winthrop for violating the, quote, bonds of reciprocal love. and for following market logic too closely. And then McCarraher is going to say that basically in the future, the Puritans are going to follow this Keene much more than they're going to follow Cotton or Winthrop's ideas. And the gospel later, so this is after they've kind of moved past that first generation, that the gospel is seen to bring both eternal salvation, but also riches and protection from enemies. And these enemies could also be understood in spiritual terms that we're going to get to in a second. So I don't know if you guys...
Yeah, that's an interesting, break from a logic of Christianity being a religion of the downtrodden and the oppressed, who can really only expect persecution by becoming a Christian because, the world is against them and their only true reward is in heaven. To go from that, to what the Puritans are preaching, takes this gigantic leap that, well, I guess it's not much of a leap. It's, as we've seen so far in this book and that we're seeing now in the Puritan era, it's like slowly compounding on itself. It's just bad theology, just getting worse and worse and worse and changing to fit the necessities of the economy as it's developing. The theology evolves to become the theology of the economy that is necessary for its furtherance along the road that it's going.
Yeah, like one of the things that was running through my mind and has been continually in reading this book is the injunction in, I couldn't remember where it was, I had to look it up, but it's the injunction in 1 John to love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. For if any man love the world, then the love of the Father is not in him. And I just think, how did y'all miss that for like hundreds of years? Well, it's not to do like some liberal gotcha stuff like, oh, he's not even a real billionaire because he won't show his taxes, right? But like, there is something that it's kind of like self-satisfying in being able to just like, oh, I remember the Bible, and without having to try at all, just like there's so much preaching against the Puritan prosperity gospel in embryo that this whole chapter deals with, or this whole section of the book deals with.
Yeah, I mean, even Jesus' teachings talked much more about money than it ever did about sexuality in terms of evil or the negative effects. So it's always weird.
Right. It's easier for the rich man to go through for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to get into heaven.
Yeah.
That's one. Or like, woe to you, rich, for you will receive no reward in heaven, for you already have received your reward here. That kind of a thing.
Yeah.
Jesus mentions the rich all like a bunch and how they suck and they're not going to heaven. But he actually never really mentions anything about like sexuality at all.
Yeah.
It takes Paul to talk about sexuality, and the word that translates into homosexuality in our Bibles just is a word for having sex with children in Greek. So it's not even about homosexuality. Fun fact.
Yeah.
Yes, I am a better Christian than Thomas Morton.
Thomas Morton sucks ass.
I'm curious for part 2. I know we spent a lot of time reading quotes and talking about the sort of fiery writing style of McCarraher. Did y'all feel like part 2 was as quotable? I felt like I didn't kind of get it's still very good and like very dense and very sharp. I didn't necessarily feel like there was as many things where I was just like, those are mic drop moments, like every other paragraph.
I had a hard time not just putting in a shitload of quotes when I was doing my notes. So,
oh, okay.
It's not as quotable because it's not like, the Romantics.
Yeah, that's fair.
There's some good stuff in there, like by the Transcendentalists. But I just said that that Morton sucks ass, but I have to qualify that because he hated the Puritans and he hated Puritan pecuniary logic in a lot of his instances, but he was also like pretty dismissive of the fact that the United States was already inhabited, or not the United States, the Americas are already inhabited by natives.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought Morton's story here was like a little bit too complicated to go through quickly, so I kind of skipped them. But I thought he was really interesting. I think that there's in this section there's several characters that I thought were quite interesting and pretty complicated, so I kind of glossed over them a little bit just to keep things simple. But yeah, I think especially for this chapter, he was one of the more interesting people that I hadn't heard of before.
Yeah, he was, for sure. I definitely sympathize with him because I also hate the Puritans.
Yeah, I mean, look, when I said I was a better Christian than Thomas Morton, I was actually thinking that was me misspeaking. I was actually thinking of William Bradford, the one who called Thomas Morton the Lord of Misrule, and was horrified by the mad Bacchanalians and their shameless debauchery.
You actually are like Thomas Morton.
Yeah, maybe a little bit. But yeah, like Morton, I think he's the first figure mentioned in this part of the book that represents the kind of syncretism. Like they still have a maypole and pagan sacramentals of various kinds that later is really delved into in a much deeper and more interesting way in the African spiritualism mixing with the Christianity taught to the slaves like much later in the 2 chapters from now. But I think Morton is the first example that the author presents of that tendency to kind of like, I don't know, engage in a sort of Christian salvage project and find like the best of all the various religious practices. Thomas Morton actually turns out to be somebody who I might want to know a lot more about, just because I'd never heard of him before this book.
Right, he like speaks favorably of the Indians, and he talks shit about the Puritans. So like right off the bat, I already liked him. But then just his treatment of the Indians, the Native Americans. This book keeps calling them Indians. Is less than laudable, so he kind of loses it at the end there for me.
Yeah, this is on page 114. It says, like the Puritan elect he despised, Morton attributed the destruction of the natives to the providence of the Almighty. Thanks to the, quote, wondrous wisdom and love of God, unquote, the English would sweep away by heaps the savages, burying the natives underneath the foundations of their godly city on a hill. So yeah, even though, definitely hated those Puritans, and that's laudable, seems like he was definitely still very much in favor of just mass genocide.
Yeah, he saw the New World as a plain parallel to the Canaan of Israel. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you guys know what happened to the Canaanites, but it was that they were all killed.
Yeah, their walls fell down.
Yeah.
Don, was there a quote you wanted to read?
So actually, speaking of the treatment of natives, so from 118, this is going to be after to move from Morton to the Puritans to talk about, here, I'll just read this from 118. It says, when they encountered the Native Americans, cast in the role of the Canaanites in a grisly reenactment of biblical drama, the Puritans recoiled from the idolaters whose degenerate customs deserved the wrath of God. The Indians' failure to improve the land offended the saints as unnatural, wasteful, and abhorrent. Confronted with such prodigal iniquity, God's chosen had a right, in fact a duty, to evict the slothful inhabitants and put the land to profitable use. And then skipping a couple sentences. Well before Locke's justification of improving imperialism, Winthrop had sketched a theology of ethnic cleansing.
Yeah. I'm a big time hater of Calvinism from way back, but like I really didn't know much about the Puritans because I've always thought American history was less interesting than European history, which is what my major focus has always been on. So I didn't really get to know the ins and outs of how despicable the Puritans actually were.
Yeah.
Especially when it came to their dealings with the Native Americans. I just assumed that just like all other English people, whenever they get around people with different skin color, they just start, oppressing and killing and stuff like that. It's just, it's inherent. It's an inherent trait of the English race, right?
Well, what's funny is the way that early American history, colonial history, is presented whenever you study it in like American schools, is that even whenever you have a curriculum that does teach the Trail of Tears, that's like a feature of post-revolutionary society, the westward expansion being like a consequence of industrial development and city life, and the need to like, this isn't the terms that you're taught it, right? But the implication is that like to sort of stave off class war, there's free land out west, and that's the reason why. Whereas the only thing you really hear about, like the early settlers and the relationship to the relations with indigenous people is, the English showed up and they couldn't farm, and the native tribes helped them, and that was like, oh, it was pretty nice, whatever. And basically you're taught that like it takes the revolution to reshuffle the relations between these two groups rather than having the genocidal wars across this continent over the course of like 150 years. Actually goes back much further to the very moment that the English set foot on the shores of modern day Virginia.
So I wanted to tag one quote here on 119, and to me, I thought this was a pretty crucial distinction of how the land was viewed by the English and the Puritans compared to, let's say, kind of some of these other perspectives that we've talked about, of how like there's the shift to sort of this synchronism, like you said, between like this sort of capitalist commodification, or sort of seeing the world as like the marketplace, and the marketplace is sort of this divine thing, in sort of relation to Locke's discussion about like improving the land is kind of what gave you the right to it. So this is just very quick. He says, thanks to the Lord of Hosts, this is McCarraher very sarcastically, just ripping apart, I think, John Winthrop Jr. and a few other folks. He says, thanks to the Lord of Hosts, the land was a cornucopia of exchange value. And quote, and I think this is from a work called Wonderworking Providence of Science Savior in New England from 1654. The line is that everything in the country proved a staple commodity. So to me, that felt like a really core distinction as well, is that now the land isn't just seen as like the land, or it can't even be approved upon. It's like everything now is a commodity. Everything now is something that like we have to then sort of like move into the marketplace. So that line really stood out to me.
Sort of prefigures the way that everything would be commodified by capitalism necessarily.
Yeah, and I'm actually reminded of Ellen Mason's Wood, some of her work on the origins of capitalism, how, I mean, at least in her analysis, that capitalism, the real key moment is whenever like food production and agriculture is the primary thing that is being commodified and put onto the market. And essentially it's whenever most of agriculture is commodified and captured by the market that in itself sort of like accelerates the commodification of all these other things. And so I guess to me, like seeing the land that way, might have kind of like a resonance of things that were still also happening. I mean, a little bit, well, actually, no, kind of around that time. Chris, just remind, what era was enclosure of the commons? Are we talking like 1640s around there?
The enclosure of the commons is really sort of finished up. I mean, not finished, like it's a process that lasts for, I don't know, like a century. But yeah, it's really just comes to a head, I think, probably in the it starts in the 14th century, but like is really sort of done by the 18th century.
Okay. Yeah, I was curious if there was just sort of a similar parallel there with like kind of starting to see the land as this, again, thing that has to be commodified and sectioned off for agricultural production.
Right. I mean, it starts in the Tudor era, when capitalism becomes enough of a part of the defining features of English society that we start calling it the modern era as opposed to the, the medieval era. And that's when there's the first set of enclosures happens. But then, like, I don't know, I don't remember when, like, there are several, like, waves of enclosure, which sort of culminate in the 17th century. Okay. So I would say that, like, the time that a lot of the literature is written and the revolts against it happen is in the 1640s, around the time of the English Civil War,
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's even that the first enclosure acts are written in the 17th century. But it's at this point it's like to accelerate and codify a process which has been underway for a while, like Chris said. But it becomes an identifiable like program of the ruling class in the 1600s with the first of numerous enclosure acts that are passed over the next couple of centuries.
So real quick to finish up this chapter, he wants to, in addition to talking about both market logic that the Puritans are using and also the proto-ethnic cleansing, there's also a little bit of on related to Winthrop and his like obsession with alchemy that prefigures the American obsession with technology and kind of proves part of McCarraher's point that this disenchantment was not necessarily a thing, that these people, and he ends the entire chapter with talking about the fact that these people in general are not people we would see as being disenchanted. They had all sorts of beliefs in magic and folklore, that those type of beliefs were pretty pervasive and common across all of society. So just kind of him further criticizing this disenchantment idea found in Weber.
Yeah, actually, I found that really fascinating for a couple of reasons. For one, I wasn't aware of the pervasiveness of like folkloric kind of witchcraft and magic and things that you, in the sort of broad popular view of history, you imagine to be stamped out by around the period immediately following the Salem witch trials. You just assume like, oh, people are pretty hostile to that stuff. But, you know, McCarraher makes the case pretty convincingly that this kind of like metaphysical culture that survives in the almanacs from the time. So, you know, we're like, who is it? Nathaniel Whitman tells people to cut timber in the winter months, especially when the moon is in Pisces, because that's the best time to cut timber. And I don't think he does it so explicitly, but there's a way in which you can read this as making the argument that this kind of persistent enchanting of the world is necessary, or it's the reason why there is the sort of magical belief in the power of money, because it's rooted in pre-capitalist modes of thinking about all sorts of things. And so it's not even just that like money and the power of money gets enchanted along the way. It's that it's introduced into a world which is still largely informed by an essentially magical worldview. So it's the last of the old and the first of the new. Like money is the transition between the two between these two worlds.
It's interesting to me that in all of this, that he never mentions any of the fraternal societies like the Freemasons or the Oddfellows or anything, because with the removal of Catholic ritual comes the explosion of people being drawn to things like the Freemasons and other fraternal societies, where they engage in hermeticism and utilize alchemical symbolism and just re-add the ritual that had been removed from their lives by the Reformation. And it's interesting that doesn't get mentioned at all, and I wonder why that is. I know it's not like it basically just underscores that there's that ritual that was sorely missed by people. There's this book called Stripping the Altars, and I forget who wrote it, but it's all about the state of English Catholicism at the time of the Protestant Reformation, and how it was a magisterial reform that was imposed from the top down in pretty much against the will of everyone involved, from the middle layers all the way down. Like the English peasantry and the English common people did not welcome the reforms. They didn't welcome any of the things that came along with the reforms, like the removal of the days off for feast days. They didn't welcome the removal of the usury laws. They didn't welcome the dissolution of the monasteries and the dissolution of the nunneries and stuff like that. In fact, it was all resisted all along the way. And the people's involvement in the rituals of the church were sorely missed once they were gone. And so they found other ways to keep the echo of those rituals alive. One of those ways being through Freemasonry and other kinds of secret societies. And it seems kind of strange that he wouldn't discuss that at all.
Well, especially interesting is that this is the chapter that deals with the revolutionary period as well.
Right.
And the role that the fraternal orders and especially the Masonic lodges play in the revolution, and so many of the figures of the revolution being members of Masonic lodges. It's a really bizarre thing to leave out.
Yeah,
Do y'all think
especially
it's-
because it was also the way they organized their essentially like the business community made bonds within the fraternal organizations, and also revolutionary bonds were made within those organizations as well.
Do y'all think it's possible part of the reason why he doesn't include that is because that sort of topic tends to be associated with more right-wing, like conspiratorial narratives about history? Because that was the first place I encountered those.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the first place I encountered him as well. You know, having grown up in a conservative Christian family, that's the first place I ever heard about Freemasonry is how they worship Lucifer and stuff like that. When in reality, it's a clearly Christian organization.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, I mean, you know what? He also doesn't mention deism at all, which I don't know. It's kind of weird. It seems like that because he mentions we learn a lot about the Unitarian Universalists, who I always thought were just like harmless hippies, but it turns out they're very much part of this whole pecuniary enchantment that he's so much against.
Well, Don, before you move on to the next chapter, you mind if I tag two quick
Go for
quotes
it.
I was interested in? So just in terms of, I'm tempted to quote Bruno Latour here and say the whole thing of like, we have never been modern, like that sort of enchantment sort of view of the world has kind of always been there. So this is on 120. He says still, and he's talking about Winthrop here. He says still his kind of alchemical and hermetic philosophy retained a hold on the Puritan imagination. As late as 1721, the Connecticut minister John Wise was arguing that by employing the, quote, lapis aurificus, is that right, Chris? I trust your pronunciation more than mine.
What is the word again? Aurificus? Aurificus?
Aurificus. We'll go with that. The lapis aurificus, or philosopher's stone, in our heads, we could turn matter into silver and gold by the power of thought as soon as any other people. The alchemical dreams of the Puritans foreshadowed later American hopes for a business millennium made possible by advanced technology, which we are going to destroy that whole perspective in part 3, which I'm going to lead, and I am so excited for. So are we moving on to the next chapter?
It's going to do chapter 5, yeah.
Let's do it, CC Don.
I forgot something. I was going to mention this, and then Jason disappeared. But an incredibly important part of chapter 4 that we shouldn't leave out because it's going to inform all the rest of what we're talking about is the reason that the Puritans felt so justified in stealing the land of the Indians and kicking them off of it is because they viewed any land that was not improved as sinful. So if you had land and you weren't constantly improving it, then you were indulging in sloth. So
Right.
they thought the Indians were always indulging in sloth, and they were pagans, and it was okay to take their land. So that's an incredibly important part of all of this whole type of pecuniary reason and the Protestant work ethic and prosperity gospel is the idea that improvement is next to godliness. Okay,
Right.
that's all.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, good stuff.
All right, so for chapter 5, between 1790 and 1860, we have Protestant evangelicalism that spreads across the nation. So gone is the predestination of the Puritans and Calvinism, and I'm going to read this on 127. That's a brief description. It says, American evangelicals combined intense and often flamboyant emotionalism, an individualist and democratic ethos, and an instrumentalist conception of reason. With their zealous pursuit of souls through missionary activity, revivalism, and cross-denominational societies, evangelicals widen the scope of Protestant authority.
I also think it's important what he says right after that. He says,
I want to read that.
Evangelicals achieved a cultural hegemony that could be every bit as coercive and exclusionary as the Puritan city on the hill, a moral establishment that Tocqueville registered when he observed that Christianity possessed, quote, more actual power over souls in America than anywhere else, unquote.
Yeah.
Yes, and just from the intro to this chapter, this line right here that the United States became a scrambling business society dominated by the pecuniary interests of ordinary working people. In a nation without a nobility or an established church, the capitalist marketplace was becoming the new religio, the bond of what passed for fraternity among competitive Protestant Americans.
Yeah, I like that. I don't think it's right at the beginning, but that he ties this this violent cultural hegemony of evangelical Protestantism. He roots it, at least in the first instance, in the absence of an established church. Like, it's the freedom of religion that the worst kind of Christians were trying to find when they left England to come to the colonies is precisely the reason why they were able to dominate so thoroughly, right? And he even says that it's that the marketplace is what passes for the fraternal relations otherwise provided by the church and communion and feast days and all of the ways in which religion organized social life in the old world. Absent an established church, the marketplace becomes a church, not only in terms of the sort of much less tangible ways that we're talking about, like the enchantment of the world through the sort of belief in the magical power of money and commerce, but also in terms of, and I think probably one can't happen without the other, but it's the forming of new social bonds on the basis of commerce, as opposed to the basis on the basis of being a part of a congregation.
And I think it's no accident either that the type of reason that has to dominate for evangelical Protestantism has to be instrumental reason, as opposed to the imagination that we talked about with the Romantics in the last part. I think that's also a really crucial distinction, that instrumental reason becomes dominant, which will then also have huge implications for technology and for all sorts of diabolical and horrible developments in the 20th century as well.
I also think, just like in the last chapter, I think it's interesting the survival of witchcraft and astrology and animism and magic and all of the things which I think typically associate with the absence of what we could call a Protestant cultural hegemony. So it casts the witch hunts in precisely the light that whatever other problems they might have, that people like Federici try to cast it in, which is not actually to root out non-Christian spiritualism, but that there's a social function, and once it's achieved, the harmless magic and witchcraft that the average tradesperson or farmer or whoever might employ in their daily life is of no consequence, because it is no longer a challenge to the social order. So it's not a religious conflict in the way that we're taught. At least I would say that that's an implication that can be drawn from at least the brief treatment of the surviving folk practices in this chapter and the last.
So let me offer a potentially spicy take. Would you all say that magic and alchemy in that form are recuperated?
Oh shit. The answer is yes.
Everything is recuperated.
Didn't you hear?
Yeah,
I did. I heard it on a show that I listen to sometimes.
SpongeBob SquarePants.
Well, I think that folk magic and alchemy have two different key audiences, because folk magic anybody can be involved in. And folk magic was the thing that the witch hunts were precisely trying to stamp out, and whereas alchemy was something that the upper classes were involved in. You had to be an educated person to be involved in alchemy.
Yeah.
So and alchemy, of course, like all magic at the time, was invocation of celestial bodies that had to do with Christianity. So it's it was all Christian. It was just sort of appealing to extra heterodox ways to harness the power of God. So it wasn't like there was the fact that magic was happening was a bad thing, because it was sort of all encompassed within Christianity. And in fact, the Pope had his own sorcerers and astrologers and stuff like that. There's actually a whole book on it called Papal Magic that I've been really wanting to dig into. But it's super interesting to see the kind of magic that gets cracked down on, and it's specifically during the Protestant era that it does. I think we talked about this last time too.
Yeah, but the point is that it breaks. The witch hunts break the back of independent models of social organization, rather than actually trying to stamp out religious or quasi-religious practices that serve a community outside of the boundaries defined by the church and the sermon, and and the specific relationship between parson and member of the congregation.
Right.
And certainly, like, there is a case that can be made that, like, yeah, sure, the Pope had astrologers, but like something like divination is just at odds with any version of Christianity if you take it very literally. At least that's the way we understand it now. I think it's interesting that it takes a very long time for that to go out of fashion, even among people who are fervent believers who might even have joined in a witch hunt were one to have happened in their community.
We get to talk a little bit about divination when we get to Joseph Smith and the Mormons.
That's my favorite part of this chapter.
Yeah, the Mormons were nuts, dude. Holy shit!
I love how
They still are. They still are.
yeah.
All right, well, let's move ahead to get to that point then. So,
Onward to
keep
the
this-
Mormons.
Yeah, keep
so-
this train moving.
Yeah, so for the evangelical still, the belief in wonders and miracles receded somewhat during these times, but belief in the divine glory of the natural law was all the stronger. Market forces and economic laws were understood as part of these, on par with things like physics and biology. So moving on to Charles Finney and the Second Great Awakening. He's one of the primary thinkers of that movement. And part of his message is that Christians are entrusted with God's money and will have to give an account of exactly how they managed it. And similarly, moving on to the Southern...
God's money.
Yeah. And similarly, Southern evangelicals saw slavery as a stewardship with which they were entrusted and which they could manage faithfully by maintaining the system. A little bit later, there was this idea that I think we see partially again in Mormonism and also partially with Emerson, but that self-creation was a partnership with divine power.
Yeah.
Which is one of the reasons why Nietzsche was such a big Emerson fan.
It's crazy how, like, the Platonic logic that underlies Christianity is completely just jettisoned from Mormonism. It's like, actually, matter is good, because this sort of Platonic logic of exists in Paul, in Christianity, specifically in Paul, and he talks a lot about how that we're not to be of the world, we're just supposed to be in the world, and how we're supposed to focus on spiritual things and focus on setting aside your rewards in heaven. It's very Platonic, right? And a lot of people posit that Paul got a lot of his ideas about spirituality and the spiritual world from the Neoplatonists, because he was a Greek educated. He was Jewish, but he was a Greek educated Jew that lived in Asia Minor. And some people say, Paul obviously came into contact with the Gnostics, or Paul obviously came into contact with the Neoplatonists because he imposes this sort of spiritual view onto Judaism where it doesn't exist previous to that. And it doesn't really exist in Jesus either, according to a lot of these people. So it's like we have a heavy Platonist component in Christianity that the Mormons just go like, nah, matter is good, actually, And guess what? You can also become God.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there is some, I feel like in early Christianity, there is some idea of like embodiedness and material creation being somewhat good, though. Like, I don't think, like, definitely in Paul, I think you see, that separation. But I think in other sources, like, I think it's like definitely, I think you have like a little bit of both going on there at the same time, which is why I think you have a lot of difficulty with the church trying to figure out how do you understand the, divinity of Christ's body and stuff. So.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. I mean, the Bible, the New Testament specifically, was written by, a dozen different people at different times, and it reflected the beliefs of disparate groups that would probably all hate each other, and it's all crammed together into a bunch of books that are supposed to agree with each other but don't. It's one of the reasons why I think it's so interesting and cool.
It is interesting. I think when you start reading it through the lens of, these are all different books that all disagree with each other and have different ideas, it's a lot more interesting than when you're reading it in an orthodox way, that all of this is like a unified theology. But
Whenever I was in undergrad, I took a early Christianity course, and we had to look at specific verses from the Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic meaning that they agree with each other, right? They're synchronized, right? They run together, and point out where they disagree with each other very, very blatantly. Like, and then the way that we understand them, and as Christians, whenever we're like raised as Christians or whatever, is, this story and that story, we just run them together, and now we think of the cock crowing 3 times, or we sort of blend all the stories together and have one narrative of it. So if you watch the Jesus movies and stuff like that, it doesn't show the version of events as it happened in any one of the Gospels. It shows just a weird conflation of all of them.
Right.
And that's just the way it's understood. So whenever I got to college and I started reading the Gospels next to each other, I'm just like, holy crap, these are totally different. They disagree with each other completely. The narrative is not seamless. But yeah, that's sort of a digression. Sorry.
That's all right. So I think he wants to. He has an interesting discussion of the first monthly business periodical in the U.S., which is called Hunt's Merchant Magazine, and he says it seamlessly blended business reportage with moral instruction and religious pedagogy. And
sounds like the most boring magazine ever.
So evangelicals also embraced an enchantment of technology and saw things like the railroads as a form of spiritual or moral progress. And let me have a quote on 140 I was going to read to do with development of the ideas of manifest destiny. By the middle of the 1840s, the predestination of the elect had evolved into the manifest destiny of all. The Puritan errand and the liberal empire became the quest for evangelical dominion. Alongside clerical economists such as Francis Wayland and Henry Carey, ministers such as Lyman Beecher preached an evangelical gospel of empire. And manifest destiny was not only just over the continent, but over the entire world. And there's like a quote about the white democracy aimed at the industrial conquest of the world. That's at the bottom of 141. And then we...
Yeah, it's...
Oh, go ahead.
So it's interesting to see that, even as early as Jefferson, you've got not just looking westward towards, joining up with the Pacific Ocean, but looking at Cuba and other colonies of the the European empires as being the next steps for the United States to start conquering. So from the very, very, very beginning, the United States has had on its mind an imperial project.
I think something that you'll see too whenever we do our episode on the Dulles brothers for our Revolutionary Politics in Central and South America series is one of the driving tenets of their whole philosophy of the world was exactly this sort of like missionary zeal combined with American empire. And those, Allen and John Foster Dulles, their perspective on that would come to shape, in horrible ways, like U.S. foreign policy and invasion and empire for, most of a century. So, it's interesting to read here that you're seeing sort of these early developments of what was eventually going to lead to, I think, a lot of the things we see still happening in the 20th century.
Yeah.
Right. And we'll also see the basis that is laid in Mormonism for just the Mormon zeal for joining the CIA and fomenting coups.
So let's move on to the section on Mormonism.
Let's do it.
So
coming, Mormons.
So Mormonism, which is developing at this time, had similar, if not even greater, emphasis on the link between material success and godliness. Like the Puritans, the first generation embraced a form of communalism that contradicted or counteracted market forces, but this tendency faded very quickly. And the Mormon doctrine that matter was eternal meant both that first that matter, the material and spiritual were closer than in Orthodox Christianity, and 2, that God himself was an entrepreneur who would take things that they found and improve them. And this was the model for, Mormon adoption of, wholesale adoption of market logic.
I don't know why. Whenever I think about God as entrepreneur, I just see Roger Stone in a top hat. It's a very horrible image to have.
So I was interested. I didn't know this, and I know a little bit more about Mormonism than just probably the average person on the street. But I didn't know that they don't believe that God created the world ex nihilo, out of nothing. That
I didn't know
that matter was already there, and God improved it, and was previously just a regular ass dude, and then that's how he became God, was by improving the world.
He came across the matter that made up what could be the universe, and he sowed seeds of stars and planets, and he plowed it, and turned it into the universe, and reaped the rewards, just like any white man can do after taking land from the Cheyenne or the Sioux or whoever's in your way.
I did know that Mormon heaven is basically you get to be the god of your own planet, which should still blow everyone's mind every time they hear that. But I didn't realize that the god that they worship is also just a regular dude that just got really good at entrepreneurship and became God.
Yeah, he bootstrapped himself into success.
Into becoming God. Yeah.
So I was going to read this quote on 148. This is, I think it's McCarraher is starting with a quote from Smith. You have got to learn how to make yourselves gods, Smith admonished his followers early on. As one of his chief disciples, Lorenzo Snow, put it pithily, quote, as man now is, God once was. As God is now, man may be, end quote. A man, this is still McCarraher, a man makes himself a god, Smith taught, quote, by going from a small capacity to a great capacity, from a small degree to another, from grace to grace, from exaltation to exaltation, end quote.
I mean, for me, I hear that, and it's not hard to just take the next leap and say, you make yourself a god by vertical and horizontal integration in your industry. That's the next thing that I hear in that line.
It's all there. It's all right there in the very beginning.
So do you think that there's just this in Mormonism imparted to you, much like in the way that Catholic guilt is imparted to Catholics, and just a self-loathing is imparted into Calvinists, that there is this just inferiority complex and delusions of grandeur that is imparted to every Mormon? I've got to become God. So, I have to be a Fortune 500 guy. I've got to, to be a great general or a great, some sort of great person in order to have improved myself and the world around me in order to become God.
I mean, you'd have to wonder if that's the core religious teaching, and you're also being socialized within a family and a community that's built on those beliefs. You have to think that they have, I'll say this as a, speaking from a therapist perspective, those ideas become absolutely structural to your whole psyche and way of understanding the world and your sense of self. I mean, the idea that they would not have just massive implications for what you think your sense of worth and how your life should be structured, I think to me, it would be impossible for them not to.
I certainly think it would be a lot harder to maintain a system of plural marriage without that sort of aspiration to godhood on the part of the male half of the Mormon faith. It's a way of getting a little glimpse of what it's like to be God, because you have dominion over other human beings' lives. And I know that there's there are some woke takes about plural marriage as being an early proto-feminism, but I don't know if I really see it.
Yeah, I don't know. I've seen Big Love. I don't buy it.
Look, between South Park and Big Love, I feel like I know everything I need to know about the Mormons. No, I did really like this because I have always thought of the Church of Latter-day Saints as thinking of its self-conception as being Christian. And this quote by Brigham Young in 1871 that says, "We differ from the Christian world in our religious faith and belief, and we do so very materially." That was a big shock to me. Like that really actually illustrated how little I learned about the Mormons from South Park and Big Love.
Right. Like I always assumed that the Mormons had some kind of like shared salvation perspective. Like, you know, Protestants, the less repulsive Protestants, don't think that all other Protestants and Catholics are going to hell. Catholics don't think that everyone who's not a Catholic is going to hell. In fact, if you really get down to it, Catholics barely think anyone is going to hell, if they think anyone's going to hell at all. But like Mormons are like, no, if you're not a Mormon, fuck you, you're going to hell. You know?
Yeah. What? Also, just in terms of interesting theology, I don't know how much this can contribute to any really important understanding of things, but this idea that the Holy Spirit is a spiritual fluid that pervades and unites all material substance in the cosmos. It's a really interesting way of, and it seems like a peculiarly like industrial American like attempt to impart a sort of scientific understanding of the divine by like ascribing like a tangible material nature to something like 1/3 of the Trinity. I just think that's fascinating.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what did you all think about the short section on 146 where he talks about the Mormons, what does he call it? Theocratic communalism or theocratic collectivism. Do y'all remember this part?
Hold on. Let me find the quote real quick.
Well, let me read it really quick because in the interest of, you know, shitting all over the Mormons, but also, you know, finding some strains that were maybe existing as well. So this is McCarraher. He says, much of the appeal and the dread of early Mormonism stemmed from its theocratic collectivism. Emulating the early Christians, Mormons officially held their property in common. Families were required to, quote, consecrate, unquote, their possessions to the church, whose elders redistributed them according to need. The Book of Mormon traces the origins and laments the evils of inequality. The fall of the Nephites, the ancient Hebrews who journeyed to America and comprised the continent's aboriginal residents, commenced when they began to be divided into classes, and that's actually from the Book of Mormon. Later critics of Mormonism, that might be all of us on this podcast right now, as well as later Mormons often downplay or overlook this communalist ideal of the Latter-day Saints. So, I mean, I think McCarraher is interesting here that I feel like he's a very generous like reader too, as like he will completely shit on something and destroy it, but then also like somehow find a thread, the one thread in there that might have been like, but there was still this sort of, you know, communalist idea that did exist. So to me, I thought it was interesting to see that in there as well.
It seems like
it's really. Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, it seems like in so many of these, they start off like the first generation or two is communal or attempting to overcome the market, and then that just falls away after that. Yeah,
and I mean, just to finish off that paragraph, he says, though hardly egalitarian and certainly short-lived, Mormon communalism reflected a desire to eradicate the capitalist market, forsaking the lucrative agony of competition for love and mutual aid. So yeah, I guess that's what's interesting, right? It's like usually those threads are like very short-lived and they're not perfect by any means, but they're there.
The best part of that,
as if religious conviction isn't a material base for the formation of socialism.
Almost.
Almost.
What's really interesting about this is that the idea that the fall of the Nephites can be attributed to their division into classes is that the Nephites, being the indigenous inhabitants of the continent whenever white people arrived, they didn't have those classes. they never actually did it.
You know, that's what we say in a psychoanalysis. That might be what we call a projection, maybe.
It's like these class-ridden societies that have like own their land privately. We got to eradicate them.
I mean, that is interesting.
Just have to go find them first.
I mean, that is interesting though, right? Like to attribute the fall of the indigenous people as like class society without any sort of critique of their own, again, like further captured by the capitalist market. I mean, there's something really interesting to me about that. Like the way that you would sort of expel the internal like division within your own society onto something else and then use that as like, you know, further basis to claim land or destroy that particular civilization, I think is an interesting one. I mean, it's important. I feel like there's a lot of, you know, terrible gravity that has and how whole ideologies do that.
Yeah, like when we think about the mental gymnastics that make up the foundations of Mormon theology, like it's really easy to focus on the magical plates, but I think this one is much more interesting, which is this desire to construct a false vision of the world outside the compound in order to justify the existence of the compound.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting that I was made aware of this recently, that there exists a Mormon worker group, just like there's a Catholic worker group, and it's basically communalist Mormons who are like trying to get back to that original ethos behind Mormonism, just like many Catholic workers are trying to get at the communist Book of Acts nature of Christianity. And I don't know too much about the Mormon worker people, but I wonder what they think, if they're going back to the early days of Mormonism, what they think about plural marriage. It'd be something to look into. It's interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, if we're considering becoming Mormons, we probably should join the Mormon worker movement.
Speaking of which, like the organization of the Mormon Church and a lot of the rituals and everything are very Masonic. It's another interesting thing that doesn't get touched on in the book at all.
Interesting, yeah.
Because like Joseph Smith was a Mason, and so was his father, I believe. And it talks a little bit in this book about how there's a lot of his sort of magical practices that he engaged in, and the divination and stuff like that, which would make sense if he was like part of an organization that's like trying to keep hermetic and alchemical teachings alive.
I like how we're doing a symptomatic reading of the text and now just focusing on the things that are systematically obscured or deleted out of the text or left out. I think it's very, I think, a super productive way to read it.
Was there anything else you guys wanted to talk about in this chapter, or do we want to move on to 6?
All I was going to say was that because I studied the Western esotericism and the occult just for fun, like for a very long time, this stuff is all glaringly obvious to me in its absence. You know,
I can't help but shoehorn this in, but one of the books that I did read that, I don't know how scholarly it is, but it was an interesting, like, historical study of the role of, like, the occult and secret societies. I think it's called The History of Secret Societies by J.M. Roberts. Anyway, I read that book like years ago, and it really stuck with me. So, for what that's worth, if anyone's interested to read that book.
That's a typical Red Library comment. This book makes me think of another book.
Yeah.
I mean, that is like the whole premise of our show is literally like, hey, you remember that book I read that one time? It reminds me of this book. That's all of my comments on the show are just streams of like, hey, I read this book once. Here it is.
That's the whole premise of libraries too. It's like, hey,
yeah, that's true.
Like books. So put some books on your books so you can book while you book.
Hey, you want some book on that book you got there? Come to Red Library. That's our new tagline.
The last note that I have written down for this chapter is about Mormonism as the first unadulterated prosperity gospel, and I think the author makes a pretty good case for that. Even despite the early communalist origins, like certainly by the time that Brigham Young is establishing a bank, which he proclaims will swallow up all the other banks, I think it's pretty clear what they're going for.
Well, and I mean, just to jump to the very last line in the chapter, because I think it's a good one. He says, as so often happens with populist firebrands, the erstwhile tribune of the laboring classes became a champion of the professional and managerial elite. The sworn enemy of Mammonism morphed into a celebrant of the upper echelons of capitalist enchantment. So he's talking about some other like populist figures, but I thought that line was, in typical McCarraher fashion, was very cutting and very elegant.
Yeah.
Well, it does happen to apply to the majority of what is surveyed in this chapter.
Right.
Yeah, I think so too.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we could go on now.
All right.
Yeah.
Chapter 6 then. So now we're talking about Transcendentalism. So we have the post-Protestant utopian communities started to spring up, particularly around the 1840s. Many of these were intended as an escape from the market revolution at the time. I'm going to read a quote from 156. So this is from Nathaniel Hawthorne. It's technically from like a fictional book that he wrote, but it is based on some of his experiences in one of these communities. This is on the bottom of 156. Pioneers of agrarian chic, visitors to Blythedale praise the Arcadians for, quote, imbuing the ordinary rustic occupations with a kind of religious poetry, end quote. This is still Hawthorne speaking. McCarraher. Verse they would never labor to compose. Yet as the arduous days wear on, the poetry curdles into the uninspired prose of drudgery, futility, and resentment. For all their hoeing, milking, and shoveling, the pastoral bohemians fail to usher in the reenchantment of the world. So there's this attempt at some of these communities, but in general, it doesn't seem to work out very well in most of them. And then he moves on to Henry David Thoreau, who visits particularly Brook Farm, and was not very impressed. In his own retreat, he continued to be critical of the market logic, but McCarraher has a nice quote here that says, on 158, "Yet Thoreau's personal dissent was memorable but unavailing, as individual nonconformity could achieve little when disconnected from any broader collective purpose."
So I have to tell you, I love this. I love all of this because I read The Transcendentalist really heavy, like a long time ago. But there's something here that reminds me of us talking about negative identification on the Lost Horizons episode, about how a lot of, sort of like bourgeois intellectuals would, be very critical of capitalism and then would want to sort of like immerse themselves in like the working people and the poor, and then would just become horribly disenchanted because they didn't match up to this ideal they had of this sort of like nobility of suffering and labor. And there's a line at the bottom of 156 that reminds me of this. He says, I guess talking about the Arcadians and the Blithedale Romance from Hawthorne, he says, "They also quickly discover that the liturgy of labor is a sweaty and grueling ritual. Quote, the clods of earth, which we so constantly belabored and turned over and over, were never etherealized into our thought. Our thoughts, on the contrary, were fast becoming cloddish," unquote. So correct me if I'm wrong, CC Don, but my impression kind of about Hawthorne's work here and Thoreau is that in some ways, like, they sort of idealized like this sort of like individualist, like return to nature, like resistance to capitalism, but we're just horribly like divested of that illusion whenever they actually did it.
Yeah. Like this one quote here says, "Intellectual activity is compatible with any large amount of bodily exercise. The yeoman and the scholar are two distinct individuals and can never be melted or welded into one substance," which, as a person that grew up doing manual labor, and before I went to college, that's all I did. After college, that's what I did. And only recently have I stopped. I could have told you that, after working in a 130-degree attic for, 10 hours, it's not very likely that you're going to go and read and write down your thoughts about it. You're probably likely going to just be exhausted and fall asleep early.
Yeah, it's funny that's a revelation to someone.
Yeah.
Man, when you get tired, it's hard to do intellectual work. But it is.
So I think moving on from Thoreau, he wants to talk about Whitman a little bit. And Whitman.
I just wanted to say one thing about.
Oh, yeah, sure. No, go ahead.
You talking, like moving us on, always prompts me to remember the thing that I was just about to say. No, is when Adam said that he was messing with the Transcendentalists real heavy for a while. How old were you? That's I wanted to bring that up. How old were you?
I believe I was 22, 23.
Yeah, something like okay, because I did too when I was like 19 or 18. I remember being in college and being like, well, I guess I'd got to, go read some Walt Whitman and Henry David Thoreau, because it was just like, that's the white guy rebel that it's acceptable to be into.
Whoa,
like
shots
Thoreau,
fired. Shots fired, Chris. Come on, what are you doing here? We're all friends here on the shows.
No, I mean, I was into it also. It's good stuff, but you have to also remember that Thoreau withdrew from capitalism and withdrew from modern society to go live in a place that his parents owned and paid taxes on.
And he would like go and have his clothes washed, and like his mom would bring him sandwiches and shit.
Yes. That kind of communism is not for the many.
I used to know a guy like that. He was really into leftover crack.
Shots fired at Wookiees. And Oogles and Wookiees. I don't remember which one is which. Do you guys remember that?
I don't.
No.
I do like the idea of transcendentalism as an American branch of romanticism. I just think that, like, I'd never really thought about I'd never really thought about this enough to have recognized that or have to come to that conclusion myself.
I will say in my defense, as a 22-year-old acceptable white guy rebel. I think that is precisely what drew me to it. And reading McCarraher's work now, it contextualizes in a way that I think at the time, either I was very subtly picking up, or I just honestly just didn't even really give a shit about, because at the time I was a musician, and I think the romantic impulse is what drew me to a lot of it. But it's an important corrective for me now, like reading this to sort of fill in that social, political, economic, contextual background and understand, oh yeah, there was a reason why I was drawn to this, and yet there were a lot of things going on with it that I just had no awareness of. But it's important to learn that now, I think.
I remember picking up Civil Disobedience and wearing my Che Guevara shirt and like sitting conspicuously in like a coffee shop, like reading Civil Disobedience,
I was reading my copy of Infinite Jest and was leering at you probably because it could have been in the same coffee shop.
Oh man, y'all remember going into places and being able to hang out in them?
God, dude, I miss hanging out in a coffee shop so bad.
I know. Yeah, Don hates it, but I definitely miss it quite terribly.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, so for Whitman, on the other hand, thought that markets had a moral value and material accumulation was necessary for both democracy and human progress. He doesn't spend a ton of time on Whitman. I don't know if you guys wanted to. He spends a lot more time on on Emerson after that. So I don't know if you guys wanted to hit on anything with Whitman before we hit Emerson.
Let's see. Whitman is another one that starts out good and then just gets real capitalist.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. What did I write down for Whitman? Whitman identified the grandeur of God with the blear of trade and toil. His cosmology of capitalist enchantment is most vivid in his Song of the Occupations, where he describes a world of enlivened objects as an affable and generous place, an animate world, a beloved democratic community of people and things. And then it goes through the poem here, which I'm not going to read.
Thank you for that.
About how, but I will read this one line. When the minted gold in the vault smiles like the night watchman's daughter, which kind of like grossed me out. But
Yeah, it's a little.
That's
creepy.
some real creep shit there.
Yeah, it's creepy and it's very, very pecuniary. So it double shitty.
Yeah, Whitman's canceled.
Walt Whitman's canceled. Sorry.
All right, so if we want to move on to Emerson.
Emerson, let's do it.
So there's actually quite a bit, several pages in this. I'll try to go through them quick, but you guys can definitely stop me when necessary. So the boundary between the material and the spiritual is erased under Emerson. Nature is divine, and basically at first Emerson wants to challenge the power of commerce and money. Economy could be a sacrament, but only for improving conditions and for helping others. Gifts and not commodity was the proper template that he saw. But later Emerson begins to embrace the full logic of the market and commerce. The world is a market, and we must embrace it fully. It is the way that we can participate with the universe. On 165, there is a discussion of his ideas of basically using the market for self-reliance. And this is on the bottom of 165. This is certainly self-reliance, but it is no theology of producerism, no acceptance of human finitude, no posture of humility. To be self-sacrificed is to be self-created. In other words, to be divine. Thus, the proprietary self-reliance that Emerson championed was rooted in self-divinization, the anointment of the self by the self as its own metaphysical and moral foundation. Yet, as Emerson himself asserted, if one's own self is divine, so are all the others, each in his own world. So when Emerson enjoined his audiences to, quote, live after the infinite law that is in you, end quote, he sanctioned the endless combat of wills that defines the capitalist order. Unlike many of his current progressive admirers, Emerson never hesitated to draw the economic conclusions from his humanism of divinized power.
I have to say the last line in this paragraph is just maybe one of my favorite lines in the whole book so far. McCarraher says, more so than Protestant economics, Emerson's theology of power captured the nihilistic energy of capitalism. I just thought that was just pure heavy metal.
We got ripped off with our romantics,
Yeah.
Well, like, the European Romantics were way cooler than the American Romantics, because the European Romantics are just romanticizing like capitalism from like 20 years ago. 20 years ago to them, not us.
Right.
But so he does say here that Emerson denounced the dominion of money that accompanied the expansion of the marketplace. His essays and journal entries at the time abound with foreboding at the spread of capitalist enterprise. He said,
what page is this on, by the way?
Well, mine it's 216, but I don't think it's the same as yours.
The EPUB is different.
Okay.
Yeah.
Never mind.
Yeah, I'm the EPUB, and I also have it like for old man eyes, like I have. The trail of the serpent reaches into all the lucrative professions and practices of man. He complained to an audience of mechanics' apprentices, and it introduced a system of selfishness, of distrust, of concealment, of superior keenness, not of giving, but taking advantage. So it's like he is, espousing praise for pecuniary enchantment while decrying the excesses of capitalism. He's got a very utopian capitalist worldview, where the European Romantics seem to have a very anti-capitalist utopian worldview.
Yeah, Emerson really just didn't like crony capitalism.
Yeah, Emerson's just a libertarian, basically.
I honestly was going to say, just sounds like a pretty standard liberal to me. It's like, oh yeah, capitalism, that's good, and it's going to create the divine community. But of course, we just got to fix its problems. We just got to make sure we regulate it properly.
We got to flip the proper levers and switches, and everything will work out great. So yeah, actually very typical, just liberal.
Fucking lib.
Yeah, so
Emerson is a lib, dude.
And I think that section that you read, is from the earlier time that he was, more critical of the market and market effects. And then it's over the next decade, maybe after that he kind of starts to transition more into basically a pure market logic type.
Was he the Unitarian pastor before he was a poet?
Yes.
Same time?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, so that's where I got that bit about Unitarians that I was talking about being harmless hippies that let socialists meet in their parish hall. Because has everyone here been to a socialist meeting in a Unitarian parish hall? Yeah.
I have.
Yeah. Just Don hasn't been.
Yep.
Is that just an aversion to meetings or what?
Yeah, generally. Yeah. If there's more than 6 people gathered anywhere, I usually don't go.
Yeah, I can see that.
When 6 or more are gathered in your name, you will not find me.
I will not be attending. Thank you.
That's in the Bible.
There you will find someone else other than me.
Don 316.
So Emerson's philosophy also defended both the laws of the market, but also the violence that was required to sustain it. It says, progress, enterprise, and destiny would leave broken bodies in its wake. And this is, quote, cruel kindness, serving the whole even to the ruin of the member, end quote, is needed. That was a quote from him specifically. That was on page... Oh, shit, I didn't write it down. Let's see.
Yeah, it's meaningless to me anyway, so I don't care.
169, I believe it was.
Nice.
Yeah, 169.
Well, Zach De La Rocha says that your anger is a gift.
Yeah, that's true.
Zach 316.
Zach.
I mean, I will say this is on 168, and I think this will start to set us up pretty well for part 3 with talking about the sort of demonic enchantment of technology and industrialization. He says, for Emerson, as for the evangelical economists and for the rising pleracy of capital, commercial expansion and industrial might were constructing a beloved community.
And so finally, he wants to end this chapter by talking about if there was a religious tradition in America that resisted capitalist logic, it could only be found in the religion of the enslaved. That they identified the hypocrisy of Southern Christianity and saw money, not Christ, as the God of the whites. And yeah, he has a really cool discussion of Nat Turner. He's going to read this quote from 174. But Turner's confession was more penetrating and veracious than all the grandiloquence of an Emerson. Supercharged with wonders, signs, and premonitions, Turner's narrative conveyed an account of the world of absolute ontological transparency, in which the material world possessed an emblematic sacramental corporeality. Seeing no barriers between the world of divinity and that of human affairs, Turner was anything but, quote, bewildered and overwrought, end quote. He discerned the malevolence of slavery with perfectly lucid precision and judgment.
Yeah, actually, that theme of there being no division between the material and the metaphysical or the spiritual world seems to be the key to whatever radical, progressive, forward-thinking substance that has existed in any of the kind of like millenarian Christian traditions from the previous section of the book and to this one. It's the refusal to demarcate between the two.
And that there's an undercurrent of that just flows through Catholicism as well, which is why so many millenarian movements come directly out of Catholicism, I think. And when I was reading Nat Turner, I'm reminded a lot of like John Ball or Savonarola, who are like very, very much theologically informed with their revolutionary zeal, you know?
Yeah, I'm trying to find the part. I wrote the note that it was... the slave's hope for paradise was political because it was religious.
Yeah, it's on 172.
But it's better in the book than it is in my notes. But yeah, like I just got to say that reading through this part made me want to read more about Nat Turner, especially when he's being interrogated by what's his name, Thomas Gray.
Yeah.
And he's like, you thought you were gonna launch an insurrection and emancipate the slaves, right? But don't you see you've kind of made a mistake? Don't you see you're wrong? And Nat Turner's response is to say, well, wasn't Christ crucified? And it's just like, that's fucking baller right there.
Yeah. And that illustrates what I think is an older Christianity. The idea that who they call the athletes of God, like the Christians who devoted their life to sacrificing themselves for other people. The martyrs of the early persecuted church, who would gladly be thrown to the lions or be tortured and killed in order to save other people, or in order to just to display their devotion to Christ. And how markedly different that is from we got to exterminate the Indians because they're not being capitalist enough, And that pure, early, just kind of suicidal Christianity, but pure and early Christianity is taken up by Nat Turner. He gets back at that early Christian ethos. And when I say it's kind of suicidal, because a lot of early Christians did actively seek out martyrdom because they wanted to emulate Christ. But I don't think that's what Nat Turner was doing. I think Nat Turner was sacrificing himself because he hoped to, free, to help, to play a part, to be a little bit of the manure of history, right? In freeing the slaves in the South.
I think one of the things I really love about this section on Turner is the way it does try to tie up threads of how there is this undercurrent, this tradition. McCarraher says, Turner's revelations raise the iniquity of slavery to the level of cosmic outrage. And I just have to make sure that the phrase cosmic outrage is said on this episode. He continues, they recall the epiphanies of medieval millenarians, Gerard Winstanley, and the romantic adversaries of Mammon. And then he goes on to say, Turner's affidavit of transcendent barbarism and redemption was perhaps the most powerful and disturbing testimony of slave romanticism. So I also wanted to kind of just connect one dot here that I'm curious what you all think about it, and maybe we'll have to save this for another episode, but I couldn't help but think about Nat Turner and this romantic anti-capitalist tradition, and also think about Benjamin and the idea of divine violence, and how that is still a concept that a lot of people wrestle with and don't really know how to make sense of, is this idea that there could be a kind of violence that somehow seeks to restart the engine of history, or seeks to cut through in a way that I think is still like very difficult to grapple with. And I mean, it's like kind of under theorized in Benjamin too. But to me, I just think it's interesting to think about Nat Turner and Walter Benjamin as like part of the same tradition. To me, that seems really important.
I mean, I think we could definitely do an episode one day about Benjamin's, critique of violence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think that we could draw from Nat Turner, Frantz Fanon, striking at power, striking at the law to strike a blow for justice.
Yeah.
As I think, like, we never, even in Augustinian just war theory, you have the idea that violence is anathema, it's bad, unless that violence that is done will keep more violence from happening and will like protect people who would be harmed by that violence in the future,
Mm-hmm.
And that same sort of thing as violence against injustice is not really violence. That is definitely something we could go off on a long ass tangent about.
Yeah. Well, we'll put that on the stack of the 50 other episodes that we're going to do together at some point. So,
yeah.
Well,
all right. So, I had some questions. I don't know if you guys are ready to move on to some of those we could talk about.
Hell yeah, let's do it.
Okay. I don't know how long these are going to take, but we'll see. So first, I was going to say that I think McCarraher is obviously challenging the narrative of disenchantment. He seems to want to eventually end with an idea of capitalist enchantment. Along the way, he kind of points to things like divination rods and alchemy as proof against this disenchantment process. Do we think that this is a fair assessment to call these things enchanting, or like I guess I don't see that much of a. I'm not able to distinguish very clearly between what these people would have seen as science and things like alchemy. I think only like backwards can we look at those things and say they're a form of superstition or something that is an enchantment. I think to them, I don't think that they would have been that clear. And so like I just have like a little bit of a hard time saying that is like proof of an enchantment.
Well, and even if it is, I would say it's a lingering holdover of the previously enchanted world, rather than, I think, proof of his thesis of the misenchanting of the world.
Yeah,
the persistence of folk magic, in spite of scientific and technological progress and the marketization and commodification of things, to me just shows the tenacity of the human spirit when confronted with the utter inhumanity of capital's drive to disenchant everything. What I think is much more useful in proving his point is the survey of Mormonism, the sort of survey of like monetary, like the kind of magical properties of money, and funny enough, I guess it's because it's not mentioned here, but like the whole idea of the invisible hand of the market is like the reason why things happen. It's like it's quite magical thinking, and it is new as of the period that is the epoch that is sort of being birthed at this point in history.
Right, and assigning a logic to the market, and thinking of the market as an entity that acts of its own volition, necessarily gives to it the same sort of power that a trial by combat would. God decides how things are going to move. God is the one who is behind the invisible hand of the market. So if ventures are met with profitability, that's the hand of God moving the market this way or that way. In the same way that if two people fought each other and one killed the other one, that's obviously God coming down and on the side of one over the other. So it's the same sort of superstition that was decried as a pagan and pre-Christian and a part of popery and Catholicism that is actually being used in the justification for the market. So that, I think, is where there's a much better case that is made for the re-enchant or misenchantment of the world. Yeah, because that is that's part of Puritan theology there, you know.
So actually, I mean that, and this is kind of where I was also going with this question as well, is like, I don't know if this is too basic or not, but I don't have that clear of an idea of exactly where the lines between enchantment and disenchantment are drawn. And that's kind of one of the problems that I've had through some of this book is something like alchemy. I mean, alchemy and chemistry, I think, especially in the early stages, are essentially indistinguishable. But even looking at something like the logic of, or I mean, I don't know if we want to talk about today, what would distinguish something like belief in, like, is science and the belief of science and enchantment? Is it just when it comes to the market that we would call it a misenchantment? Like, I don't know. I guess I'm just still a little bit unclear of exactly where McCarraher is drawing these lines and how you guys understand what the difference between enchantment and something that is not enchanted would be.
So when it comes to technology, I would say that the enchantment of technology is the idea that that there is something inherently spiritually good about technological progress, and that technological progress is evidence of God's will being carried out. That is where I think that science and technology is being enchanted here. And wait, what was the other part of your question? What did you say? Is there a difference between enchantment and what? Sorry, I forgot it as I was answering the question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just like, what would, if we talked about contemporary beliefs, what would enchantment look like when it comes to, I don't know, the market or to science compared to disenchantment?
Okay.
So I kind of think that, I mean, one of his principal positions is that there is no
disenchantment.
There is no disenchantment, right?
Yeah.
There's only a misenchantment, so that, like, we still are just as enthralled to unverifiable, unquantifiable faiths and beliefs in processes and systems and entities and forces that are beyond our grasp and control, or maybe that can be divined and channeled, as any pre-modern, medieval, or even pre-class level of society has ever been. It's just that we have the Enlightenment has given us a language to obscure even our enchantment, so that we don't recognize it as such. But I think that's why it's hard to make a distinction. Mm-hmm. It's because it's not possible, because we are, because we are still living in an enchanted world. It's just that we find the magic in some of the least interesting and least magical things. Like, it's not in the rising and setting of the sun, but it's in the ability for value to beget value or appear to beget value. But we're not really approaching the world cosmologically any different than anyone else ever has.
If there is no disenchantment and there's only misenchantment, I guess it's like odd that he seems to spend in most chapters a little bit of time talking about how these societies are not disenchanted, that they are enchanted, and he kind of points to things that we would normally think of as like magic or superstition, instead of just focusing on the fact of like the way that they believe is, even if it's science or something that we would think of as irrational, that this is still a form of enchantment. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
I kind of think that he's, and maybe he could spell it out a little better, but I sort of took it the implication to be that the persistence of these kind of primitive superstitions, to use like the parlance of the person who has a mystical belief in science, because it's not like everybody is in a laboratory doing science. We have a belief in science, right?
Yeah.
But the persistence of these, pre-scientific views of humanity and our place in the universe is proof in itself that the perpetual march of scientific progress has done nothing to obliterate our enchanted view of the world. Mm-hmm. That you can have side by side, people blasting the Sierra Nevada, whatever, blasting through mountain ranges to lay a railroad track, and then also like using a divining rod to try to find gold, because no matter how far we've advanced, we've landed on the moon, we're talking about going to Mars, whatever, we still have the same that we are still just as likely to interpret the world in the way that people who thought the earth might be flat or that diseases might be caused by sin, because there is no disenchanting of the world.
Wait, so diseases aren't caused by sin?
Well, they are. That's,
okay.
but
they obviously
are.
So
that's kind of like, to me, it seems like an implication that, like, just by virtue of just by mentioning that these things still exist, it proves the point in a way that he could spell out a little bit more fully.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think that sort of the mystical belief in pretty much anything a scientist says is pretty obvious. Like, we're not all scientists. We don't have the access to lab results and peer-reviewed studies that scientists do. So there is a certain amount of faith that comes along with accepting what scientists tell us is true. And we have a faith in the scientific method, and we have a faith in peer-reviewed journals. But there also is the uncritical support of pretty much anything any scientist says anytime it pops up on Facebook. And that's pretty evident now when you get basically religious schools of different, I believe the WHO, well, I believe the CDC, and they're like people yelling at each other about whether or not this study or that study about COVID is the correct one. And that shit happens on my Facebook wall like every day. It's like religious fervor behind different scientific views. It's sort of like, it reminds me of a South Park article. Remember, Jason?
Yeah.
Not article, episode. Yeah, I'm trying to make South Park more academic, where these two future societies go to war over whose science is best.
Yeah. I feel like it's important, now that we've made two South Park references, it's important to at least officially distance us from South Park.
I haven't watched South Park in like 20 years, okay?
Yeah, it's not
like
actually a
15 years or
show.
something.
Not actually a show that I enjoy. Although, now that I have said that, there is a caveat, which is that the World of Warcraft episode was one of the best things that's ever happened to television. But otherwise, South Park's not.
I haven't watched it in years, though. Yeah.
It's probably way worse than I remember it.
Yeah.
So if all beliefs are forms of enchantment, like what is the value of talking about these things as enchantment? If there's like no, or like, I mean, I had a question. This was a later question, but I feel like it might be good to bring up now. For leftists, like I feel like there's a lot of value for him to talk about this as like capitalism as like another religion, because I feel like part of what he's arguing for as a Christian is probably a return to some more genuine form of Christianity. As like a leftist for leftists who aren't Christians, like what do we think is the value of identifying capitalism as like a different religion? And if we're talking about all things being able to be, or all things are enchantment, I mean, wouldn't communism or Marxism be just another also enchantment as well? I guess it's just like, it's hard for me to, I think it's a great history. I find it very fascinating. I'm just curious if there's some degree in which I feel like if you're not a Christian in the way that he is, the value of the narrative he's trying to say maybe isn't quite the same.
I'll just jump in on this. I think that so far my reading of the book is like more serving as a corrective than anything else to particular tendencies. I mean, I won't speak necessarily as like a Catholic or a Christian, but definitely I would say like for a Marxist and someone on the left. I mean, I think about discussions I have all the time, and this is something I'm increasingly like more and more sharp in my criticisms of, is the way that I think Marxist and leftist perspectives adopt a sort of enchantment of science, like in just the same way that fucking like people who will find a Neil deGrasse Tyson quote on like a Facebook page and then will share that as if it like, it's a valid interpretation of a certain kind of set of experimental results, and then like generalize to what the meaning of the universe is based on those results. I think a lot of people on the left enchant science in a similar way, but again, to me, it's that they don't ever recognize that there's a similar functioning of belief and like quote unquote enchantment, the way that McCarraher is describing. And
right. Yeah. So I think that's helpful, because I guess part of my question was like, if all things are enchantments or misenchantments, if we identify that, like this belief in science is a misenchantment, like what do we see as the enchantment that we're looking for? Like, what does that look like? And because obviously, I think for us, or I guess as maybe non-Christian leftists, I think those ideas of like misenchantment would be maybe different for us than it would be for McCarraher. And like, what does it look like for there to be like a good like a non-misenchantment? Like if science is always going to be or like if science is capable of being misenchanted, what does it look like for science to not be misenchanted?
I would say that a good non-Christian enchantment would be sort of akin to some of the early romantics who see in nature just a spiritual quality that exists, even if it isn't necessarily defined as spiritual, where there is just it has an untouchable, unassailable beauty that it is just that nature is sacrosanct and should be approached with all the reverence that you would approach a divine object were you a Christian. So like that would be a good enchantment that is a non-Christian enchantment. Because being unable to comprehend ecosystems without a heavy scientific background, it would make a lot of sense for you not to go and just dig up this tree in your backyard or whatever, right? It's just on a small personal level. Approaching nature with the reverence that the romantics would have you approach nature with, I think would be a very good secular enchantment.
I also think too, I'm going to give a shout out to the Socialism and Ecology series that they're doing at Cosmonaut right now, and the work I'm doing on reading like Kohei Saito and things like that is I do think there is a tendency in this sort of more, let's say, quote unquote, like scientific materialist approach to like anti-capitalist politics, regardless of whatever strain that happens to be, is one of the assumptions that you make more often than not is you have sort of enchanted that methodology in a similar way to the exact type of capitalist sort of tendencies that McCarraher is after, which is basically to see that the world is kind of this like waiting reserve of materials for you to use in the processes of production. And I think that one of the things I would wonder about is that if you were to have this sort of like non-Christian, like leftist kind of enchanted view of the world, would it necessarily be like very ecologically and environmentally focused? Like, yeah. And I mean, my assumption would be that it would have to be, because if it's not that, then the world is still just almost like what Heidegger would say, like they're just like resources like waiting to be used by humanity, and if they're not being used by humanity, it's like we don't really give a shit about them. You know, I'm not a Heidegger supporter, just to say that, but I do think that there is a way that like that critique is about what is it that science does to the way we see the world, and it sees everything as resources waiting to be used and turned into commodities or something else that's useful to humanity. And I say, like, fuck that. Like, we need to have less things that are useful to humanity. I mean, that's like maybe part of what I would see about an enchanted like leftist, you know, again, I mean, to me it's like just like hardcore like radical like eco-communist politics, but
smashing Cartesian dualism. And I don't know, so like to me, I don't know, I've got a view of, I think, animal life that most leftists probably aren't going to share, that I think that it's not really ours for making use of. And I would think that an enchantment, a good enchantment would be one that gets rid of factory farming because of how wasteful and destructive it is and brutalizing it is to animal life. I don't think that it's necessary for us to do that sort of thing. A good enchantment would be one that sees animal lives as being worth something and not just commodities to be just thrown into the capitalist profit machine, right? And of course what Adam said.
So are we contrasting like enchantment with like is enchantment just in a sense like an emotional like buy-in to a belief or something like that? Like, I mean, I feel like you could have some sort of belief in the negative effects of the meat industry or something like that. But I don't, you know, I think that would be different from looking at, you know, animal life as being enchanted or something. So I guess like when you guys are talking about viewing that as being enchanted, or Chris, when you're talking about it, like viewing nature as being enchanted, how do you mean that as distinct from just like a belief in the divine nature of it? or in the spiritual nature of it?
I don't know that I would.
Or don't you? Okay. You mean the same thing. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
I was going to say, I think that part of the way that I understand the concept of enchantment is a willingness to be enchanted.
Right.
It's
Like
not
I'm not
just-
an atheist and I'm not interested in trying to find a secular reason to enchant things, you know?
Yeah, it's kind of like I think the reverence for nature and the intangible qualities of the whole of the universe of which humanity is a part, as occupying a specific spot, and that reverence for that intangible quality can that can apply here when you're talking about the way that human beings relate to other species or the natural world or space or whatever it is, and that there is in both directions a sort of there is an intentionality to it. So you can either intentionally try to disenchant these things, and like pigs are for chopping up and turning into sausages, and asteroids are for mining, and fields are for being plowed, and mountaintops are for removal, and so on. Or you could and that's a thing that I think a person has to like continually reassert, both at the individual and the level of like a society overall. There's a willingness to disenchant these things, because that's the function of ideology, right? Is to help manifest, to help I guess to help guide the way in which a person acts upon the world. And similarly, when we're talking about a willingness to be enchanted, is it's a leap of faith that I think it makes people really uncomfortable to think of what they're doing as being intentionally having a faith. But I don't think there's a way to get around it. And I think that that's maybe the unspoken thesis of this book, is that whether you're trying to disenchant the world or you're allowing yourself to be enchanted by the world, in both cases, it is something that you're trying to do, and that you have to continually reassert on a higher and higher level in order to sustain it.
All right. So I didn't mean to be difficult with all those questions. I just was
this is a good discussion.
I mean, 'cause I feel like I get the impression that I understood, I think, enchantment in a different way than y'all, which I think is maybe part of the
How did
the
you
disconnect
understand
and
it?
stuff. I guess I would have understood it as like being if you look at an enchanted world, it would be one that's full of forces that you can't predict, that sort of have their own wills or their own desires. And so, like, when I look at the disenchantment of nature, even if I value it, even if I place some sort of divineness to it and try to respect it, that my interactions with it would still be very different from someone in the medieval period that would sort of see it as like a realm that like can't be predicted necessarily, that is full of spiritual powers and forces that that are imbued with some form of like will or goal or desire or something like that is distinct from humans.
I mean, one thing I was going to mention as well is that whenever I think about like defining enchantment versus disenchantment, I mean, maybe one way I see like quote unquote disenchantment being defined, conscious, like, overtly or more like covertly, is almost this idea that everything can be understood through strictly material processes and composition.
Right.
So, and again, I'm just going to distinguish this from like someone talking about like the material forces of history and like that, how things have to be understood, versus this like ideological, like idealist sort of perspective, but that you can understand everything as if this is just like raw material, versus that there might be some, and the question would be like, how do you understand what the other thing is? But is there something else that is operating within the material or alongside, or however you want to define that somehow, you can't collapse everything to just like a raw, like scientific material explanation of why these things exist or how they function. I was actually curious to ask you, I mean, do you think there's a relevance to talking about like what's enchanted versus disenchanted in the framework of what is sacred versus profane? Because I was wondering about that too. It's like whenever I think about things are enchanted, like if we talk about nature in this way, I mean, I think I'm pretty clearly thinking of it as, well, those are things that are sacred and like outside the realm of like humanity and like the realm of the profane. So that might be another way to think about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, there might be let's say that there are obviously profound differences in the way that a modern reverence for the natural world would let me say that again. There are obviously profound differences between a modern reverence for the natural world and a pre-modern reverence for the natural world. But I would say that more importantly, the similarities should be foregrounded, because whether you think of nature as being pure chaos and unmanageable or not, the result of trying to dominate nature is still chaos and it's still unmanageable. So like, we understand all sorts of things about ecosystems, and yet our fierce determination to subordinate nature to our will as a species has set us on the course for the potential extinction of life on the planet, or at least of our capacity to sustain civilization. So yeah, we might differ in a lot of ways, but ultimately that like profound reverence for the untamable qualities of the natural world is still vital to our survival.
And I think too, just for what it's worth, I think if we come back to the initial setting up in the introduction in part one, I mean, I think McCarraher's whole book is a sort of critique of ideology, in a way, of the desacralization thesis that like Max Weber developed in Protestant Ethic and Spirit of Capitalism. So I guess, I mean, to me, for what it's worth, it's like, even if we don't have clear definitions of that distinction or what's enchanted versus disenchanted, and maybe kind of like what Jason was saying, for me, I think it's maybe the whole like driving point of the book is to like undermine anyone who has any, you know, implicit or explicit belief that there are these two different things. Like, you know, the pre-moderns were enchanted, we're not enchanted, and that's the distinction. And just to like undermine or attempt to undermine anyone's ability to try to hold that ideology, because I guess he sees that it's almost like capital's power is increased by that being obscured from us.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it implies that capitalism is free of mystical superstition, and instead of impregnated with it.
Yeah, I mean, when I had read at least the part of the book that I've read so far, I guess when I approached it, because like when I was a Christian way back in the day, there was like a realization that I came to that my way of understanding, and I think wouldn't have used the term of disenchanted, but I realized it was like a very different way that the older forms of Christianity believed, right? Like my form was a very of like a mechanistic universe presided over by a divine spirit that kind of created it all. And I realized that was like vastly different from an earlier Christianity that saw spirits and powers as being like all over the place. And it's like a world that you constantly interact with those things. I thought, at least maybe I was bringing a little bit too much of my own experience to that. I thought McCarraher's point was not necessarily that we could, you know, find some sort of reenchantment, but just that we have a reenchantment. It's just capitalism. And that, you know, I guess I still wasn't entirely certain if McCarraher was trying to say that we could, in a sense, re-enchant like our own, you know, like our own worldview of nature or something like that.
Doesn't he specifically say that any attempted re-enchantment has just been a massive failure?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think he called it a sort of like individualistic, sort of like nihilist therapeutic technology to try to somehow like make you feel better about the world, but it's always going to fail.
Yeah, that's what he said. Something like that. Yeah. I think he was specifically referring to New Age
right.
Enchantment.
Well, in terms of if he's going to eventually advocate for some sort of re-enchantment of the world in a different way, we have another 800 pages.
Yeah, he's got a long time. He's got a long time to do it. So, how are you doing on time? I don't know.
We're like way over 2 hours.
Shit. Okay.
Yeah, we're like 3 hours now. But if you've got good shit, man, let's go.
Yeah. I'll skip one of them. I did want to hit on this one a little bit, and we can maybe save it for another time, but I'll just say it. So McCarraher, I don't know. I was having a hard time maybe interpreting some of his intention here, but he seems to want to champion the religion of the enslaved over the Puritans, Evangelicals, and Transcendents. But as he kind of shows that all of those are enchanted to a certain degree, and all are materialistic in the sense that they have a strong connection between the spiritual and the material. It seems to be just a question of which narrative defines them, the Canaanite genocide or the Egyptian exodus. If that's the case, because it seems to like he almost seemed to in some ways condemn the strong connection between the material and the spiritual for like the Mormons for example, but then wants to say that the slaves had a very similar like didn't necessarily separate the material from the spiritual. They saw their religion as one that encourages both a spiritual freedom but also like a very physical type of freedom. If that's the case, does it like is then like enchantment or misenchantment like does this kind of the right way of talking about the problems between these, or is it more of just like in a sense they both have similar a structure to their beliefs? It's just a matter of which narrative they ascribe to. And I guess I felt like the purpose of the book here was like a little bit, because he seems to be kind of wanting to do two things. He wants to use it as like a refutation of Weber, but also as like a bit of a condemnation of the American religious tradition. But in this case, I don't really feel like that they go together that well, because it's not that clear of what this analysis of disenchantment is doing for the difference between these two forms of religious understanding, or religious tradition.
I guess my thought about that, because I was thinking of this in one of your earlier questions, is almost my read would be how in some ways these types of belief, or the ways that people believe, or how they engage with this sort of dichotomy, is very, very strongly a question about what material interests are they serving? Like what material forms of social arrangement are they valorizing versus resisting?
Right.
And so I almost kind of read the connection between how the Mormons talked about material and spiritual versus like Nat Turner as really a question of looking at like what do the larger political and like material conditions do to these particular ways of believing. And so I mean, I don't know if I want to say that there's a bit of like a kind of like history from underground, or like people's history of this in some way, but I can't help but feel that way, like reading it, to be like, wow, like there's all these like narratives that were happening that were never really, that I never really encountered, even in the things that I read.
Yeah, I guess it was a question of how does this, like, putting it in this narrative of misenchantment, it doesn't really seem like it helps to explain why one is, one is despicable and the other one is good. Like, I mean, is he not wanting to do that, and I'm just kind of misreading him here, and is he just kind of trying to explain these different currents that all kind of feed into this story of misenchantment that he wants to tell? Because it seemed, I guess I was just surprised that he doesn't really seem to address it at all, that actually both of these strains, both the very positive and the very negative ones, seem to have a really strong connection between the material and the spiritual. He kind of wants to highlight it, but never actually, talks about the fact that they both have them.
I think that he whenever he's talking about good enchantment, right, in the first chapters of the book, he mentions how that type of enchantment was used for both good and ill, and ignored when it was convenient for the church to do so in the pre-Reformation period. And then I think that he similarly, whenever he talks about pecuniary enchantment, mentions that there is this sort of covenantal agreement where we're going to use the wealth created by this type of enchantment for the betterment of all, that is sort of shunted aside in favor of the more nakedly ambitious and accumulative kind of theology. So I think that he shows that what I think is that his value judgment lies in the potential, and that there is more of a potential for liberation in the type of enchantment that he calls good enchantment, and more of a potential for domination and environmental destruction and reckless accumulation in the pecuniary enchantment. And I don't think he outright says that. He doesn't outright make that condemnation so much as he just sort of hints at it. He might get to that later on in the book, but you know, I think that he definitely, like Adam said, shows that the material gain that can be had is definitely a huge influence on how the theologies are used. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's like if you are a slaveholder, you can justify your position. You can find biblical verses which help explain what you deem to be the natural order because you are on top. And similarly, if you're a slave, you can find in scriptures an injunction to rebel. And in both cases, it's ideology made into material force through the way in which people understand a lack of division between the spiritual and the material.
He sounds a lot less Marxist in these chapters than he did in the earlier chapters, I think. I think that he makes it more explicit that he's actually viewing this through a materialist lens as he's talking about enchantment, you know?
I would agree with that too. I think reading the introduction in part 1, I came away just being like, this is a complete like firebrand, like radical leftist take on this. I guess my take wasn't so much like, oh yeah, this is going to be a clearly objective, like history just laying out. It's like, no, this is obviously someone who's like very leftist, very anti-capitalist, who is writing in a very polemical, like rhetorical way. So, but I do think that came out a lot more in part 1 than this. So
yeah, I mean, I guess it was just a question of like when I was reading it, and for example, Mormonism, like, and he kind of wants to say like part of the problem is this really close conflation of the material and the spiritual, when it almost would seem like from his position, maybe he should have just said, actually, they just, were in a position of power and therefore we're like inherently going to misuse it. Like it, I don't know, like it seemed like he kind of wanted to put part of the rationale or the blame on the beliefs, when actually, I don't know, I feel like from his position, maybe from our position, it would just be about, what class and what social function these people found themselves in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's an ambiguity there that is maybe not conscious, but maybe is conscious, because there are also, and it's not dealt with again in the chapter that we just went through. It's another one of those interesting omissions. Like, we don't hear about the role of the Quakers and Shakers and Congregationalists in the anti-slavery movement and their explicit denunciation of the evils of slavery on, purely religious terms. And that, like, John Brown, just like Nat Turner, John Brown sees himself as a crusading figure, as like the hammer of God being brought down upon the iniquities of the world. Even though John Brown is not a person who, in his immediate relationship to the material world, needs to be emancipated from slavery. So it's not just like material interests can find a sort of spiritual expression in order to like justify and help clarify what those material interests are, like in the case of Nat Turner or in Nat Turner's slave master. In the case of John Brown, it's just, I am compelled by righteousness to go out into the world and manifest God's will. So I just think it's much more complicated, and so again, I don't know if that omission is intentional and if that ambiguity is intentional, but I would say it would make sense if it were intentional, because I think that we could walk ourselves into a blind alley, or we could diminish our capacity to assess if we had concluded in all of this that it was just a matter of material interests and ideological justification, ex post facto or whatever.
We could say, it's much more interesting and complex than that, comrades.
we could say that.
No, I do think that's interesting, though, because I could imagine that if you could write this book in a very different way and talk about, let's look at the historical variations in ways that Christian belief or whatever it was is used in all these different capacities, or the variations and myriad forms it takes. But to me, it's almost like, I wonder if like a lot of those omissions are from him delimiting his project in a very particular way, and it's almost like he could probably write about a lot of that stuff, but again, it would be a 3,000 page book instead of a 1,000 page book. And to me, I think the symptomatic read is like, I do wonder if it's just something that is just, he's trying to cleave very closely to like, what is my very specific like thesis of this book and what am I pushing against? And, and I think it's kind of, he still writes 1,000 pages about it, but shit, he has to leave out so many nuances that, maybe we're kind of picking up on.
Yeah.
Right. Well, like for, if the point is just to make a particular case against capitalist rationalism as disenchanting the world, then you could leave out Nat Turner, and you could leave out everything that let's call the positive enchantments in every chapter we've read, and you could make the point very explicitly. But then I think that there's a very understandable tendency in writing a historical survey of anything to, well, especially in this case, to like not be just writing a book about how religion is used to oppress, which I think is the way you could read it if some of these other examples weren't there, even though the existence or the presence of those examples serve to somewhat dilute the overall point. Like it's necessary to be there, but it almost demands that more material is there because more material is there. It's like with the eating comes the appetite.
I will say this too. I just looked at the flap, the cover flap on this, and just to kind of drive home exactly what is the point, he says, if socialists and Wall Street bankers can agree on anything, it is the extreme rationalism of capital. And so maybe in some way, to me, that's a pretty clear, just short, succinct statement of like, oh yeah, this is what he's trying to do. He's really trying to like undermine a very core shared belief among what would seem to be two, absolutely dichotomously opposed ways of seeing the world. All right, y'all, we're going to get out of here for the week. Big shout out to the Regrettable Century podrads, as always, being excellent, being enchanted in the best possible way. For our Enchantments reading series for part 3, I'm going to be taking the lead on that one, and I am very, very excited as we are going to focus on some of my favorite topics, such as management theory, the history of marketing and public relations, the role of imperialism in the development of capitalism in the United States and abroad, and all sorts of other good stuff. And that will be coming your way very, very soon. In the meantime, let's go out the way that we always do. Remember that your podrads here at Red Library, across the Lost Horizons network, we out here. Don't ever forget, and we hope to see you around on the Discord servers very soon if you're not there already. But in the midst of the ongoing coronavirus pandemic, apocalyptic scenario, global worldwide meltdown, remember to stay hydrated. Stay motivated. Keep searching with us and with everyone out there, all your comrades, for ways to be emancipated. Keep dreaming. Keep fighting. I would say don't lose hope, but remember, we subscribe to the courage of hopelessness here, which means go through the hopelessness, embrace it, so you can engage in that dialectical reversal to find a new, contradictory relationship between both hope and hopelessness. Don't worry if you're not sure what that means. We're all trying to figure it out. That's the goal. That's the project. Keep those masks on, especially if you're out there in some of those protests that are ongoing. Stay radical, stay revolutionary, stay critical, and we'll see you back here next time on Red Library. We out of here. Peace.